I'm Sonia Michelle, Director of United States Studies here at the Wilson Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all this afternoon to a discussion of a new book by Carla Peterson, Black Gotham, A Family History of African Americans in 19th-Century New York City. We're really delighted to have Carla with us today, and also two other historians whom I'll introduce in a moment. This is a very special occasion for lots of reasons. It kind of fits into a series that we've been doing on cities. We've done several events around cities, and we're also, of course, always interested in African American history. So this book brings all of those things together. In the introduction to this book, Carla talks a lot about history, making history, monuments, how one goes about the process of doing history, and in this particular case, searching for the roots of her family. And of course, whenever I open an event at the Wilson Center, I talk about the Wilson Center as a living memorial to President Wilson. And in a way, we're always sort of excavating, this is a living memorial, so we're always kind of excavating the history of President Wilson. And often some of the things we find are not so flattering to President Wilson, but we talk about them anyway. And in this case, I think Carla has also gone about the task of doing her history, tracing the roots of her family, with her eyes wide open and reporting on everything that she found. I'm just going to introduce our speakers briefly because you have bios in front of them, but we really have with us today a remarkable collection of scholars. Carla Peterson herself is a distinguished scholar in the field of English, in the field of American literature and African American literature. Her first book, Doers of the Word, African American Women Speakers and Writers in the North, 1830 to 1880, was a pioneering work in the history, in excavating and recovering the history and the texts of African American women writers, and it was a great contribution to the fields of women's literature, African American literature, and African American women's literature, and of course, really broadened in all of that kind of work has really broadened what we think about when we think about the canon of American literature. And of course, what's so remarkable about this book is she has turned herself into a historian, which is a daunting task to do even when you start out, but to have it started as a second career is really quite a challenge. But one of the wonderful things about the book is that the bones of it are there. She explains as she goes along how she found various documents, how she responded to them, what these documents told her, and how she's been able to put the story together that she tells in this book. And she'll tell you more about the details. After Carla tells us about the book, we're going to have two comments. One by Adele Logan Alexander, who is a professor at George Washington University, has taught African American and African American women's history there for a long time. Professor Alexander is also a pioneer in the field of African American history and African American women's history, and as you can see from her bio, she's written some important books, especially exploring the field of African American family history and really developing that craft, because it's a very particular kind of craft to be able to trace family roots and so forth. So we're very fortunate to have her with us to focus on that aspect of Carla's book. And then finally we have with us a very distinguished women's historian and historian of cities, Mary Ryan, who is currently a professor at Hopkins University after a distinguished career at the University of California at Berkeley. I remember when I first was starting out as a graduate student in women's history, reading Mary's first book, which was called The Cradle of the Women of the Middle Class, which talked about it was really something that got us started thinking about women and family history. And then she went on to do pioneering work in the history of cities, especially the social and cultural history of cities, and often women in cities. So she's going to focus on the kind of urban dimensions of this book. So altogether, I think we have a very well-rounded panel, and I'm sure we're going to learn a lot this afternoon, and I'm really delighted to have all of you with us to hear this wonderful panel. So I'll turn the floor over to Carla.
Thank you. I was going to speak from here, but this light is a little disturbing, so maybe
over here.
Go up to the podium.
Did you take it off?
Yes, I did.
Well, I'll yank you off when it's
okay.
time. I'll get the hook out.
It is someplace. I don't know.
Did you put it in your little thing? Oh, okay. We'll find it.
It's in my hand.
It's in
there we go. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for coming out on this beautiful, warm day. Spring is coming, right? So thank you for coming. And this is actually my first presentation on my book post-publication, so it's a big event for me. I have so much to say. It was so hard to figure out how to organize this, so Sonia asked me to talk for 30 minutes, and I hope I don't go over. I might have a little bit of a timing issue. So I wanted to start off my talk today with two quotes that begin to explain what I was trying to do with the book. The first is one that I wrote and goes as follows. We still hold certain truths about African Americans to be self-evident, that the phrase 19th century Black Americans refers to enslaved people, that New York State before the Civil War denotes a place of freedom, that blacks in New York City designates Harlem, that the black community posits a classless and culturally unified society, that a black elite did not exist until well into the 20th century. The lives of my New York forebears belie such assumptions. They were born free at a time when slavery was still legal in New York State. They lived in racially mixed neighborhoods, first in Lower Manhattan, and then after the Civil War in Brooklyn, at a time when Harlem was a mere village. They were part of New York's small but significant black community, and specifically its elite class. So what I'm trying to show with this quote is that from the point of view of my profession, my professional standing, there were a bunch of myths about 19th century Black Americans that I was seeking to explode, and I go through the 3 or 4 or 5 that I have here. My second quote is actually the epigraph of my prologue, and it is from Toni Morrison's Beloved and goes as follows. Denver was seeing it now and feeling it through Beloved, and the more fine points she made, the more detail she provided, the more Beloved liked it. So she anticipated the questions by giving blood to the scraps her mother and grandmother had told her, and a heartbeat. Denver spoke, Beloved listened, and the two did the best to create what really happened, how it really was, something only Setha knew because she alone had the mind for it and the time afterward to shape it. So this quote really resonated with me because I felt that I was listening not to my mother's stories, but to my great-great-grandfather and my great-grandfather's stories, and I was trying to put a heart, blood and a heartbeat to them to make it into a full history. And I would also say that what I try and do is use their lives, their stories, to put blood and a heartbeat to the more general academic study of 19th century Black New Yorkers. So when these two motivations converged and I started to think about doing this project, I had a problem, which was that I had no stories. I had no documents from my family. I had no oral histories, no writing. And all I had was a name. And the story that was attached to the name turned out to be false. So the name was that of my great-grandfather. His name is Philip Augustus White, and it's not helpful when you're tracing ancestors to have an ancestor with the last name of White. And the story that I was told about him was that he was a Haitian, born in Haiti, who left at the time of the Haitian Revolution, went to Paris. He'd been born Philippe Auguste Blanc, went to Paris, became a pharmacist, and then came to the United States. Well, the only part of that story that proved to be true was the name, Philip Augustus White, was the fact that he lived in New York, and also the fact that he was a pharmacist. Nothing else turned out to be true. So I had to go, and I was faced with this issue of what do I do? How do I tell a history if there are no memories in my family, and if nothing was remembered? And so when I started digging, the first thing that really, really surprised me was the will to commemorate and to remember on the part of 19th century Black New Yorkers. It's not that they wanted to forget this history that was troublesome in so many respects, but there was a real will to remember. There were commemorative ceremonies, the abolition of the slave trade starting on January 1, 1808. There was the abolition of slavery in the British colonies in 1834, and these were repeatedly marked every year. There were newspapers that sought to tell stories, to relate events of what was happening, and record them in print. There were attempts to create monuments that would be long-lasting memorials to important people. But what happened was that Black New Yorkers lacked resources. The community was poor, underfunded, and so many of these attempts to commemorate fell by the wayside. A desire to build a monument to honor Henry Highland Garnett came to nothing. Newspapers lived on for 2 or 3 years, and that was it. And of course, the greatest example, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is the Negroes' burial ground. So for a full century, the cemetery for Black New Yorkers in Lower Manhattan that gets disbanded in 1795 with this kind of real estate boom in New York, and basically is not rediscovered until 1993. And then there's the problem of the archives. Without resources, how can you create and keep archives? So you can think of John Pintard, white elite New Yorker who founded the New York Historical Society in 1804, but then we have to wait until the 1920s to get Arthur Schomburg's collection and library. The problem was that I needed to go to the archives. That was the only place that I could go to. So what I do, I think, as Sonia noted, was that in my book unfolds on 2 levels. One is the search in the archive for the material, what I found and how I put the material together, and secondly, the story itself. So I liked Sonia's reference to the bones, and I am indeed showing the bones, the skeleton on which I build my story. So the Schomburg was invaluable, and I made 2 really important discoveries there. I went to a collection at the Schomburg, and I found 2 pages torn out of a scrapbook, and this was luckily very early on in my search. On one page was pasted the obituary of my great-grandfather Philip Augustus White, whose name I knew, and on the second, that of my great-great-grandfather Peter Guignon. So just to give really quick thumbnail sketches, Philip White was born in 1823 in an impoverished family, went to one of the African free schools, then trained with James McCune Smith, Black doctor and pharmacist, one of our first, became a pharmacist, opened his own drugstore in Lower Manhattan, and made quite a bit of money, moved to Brooklyn in 1870, lived very well, devoted to education and to St. Philip's Episcopal Church, and became the first Black member of the Brooklyn Board of Education in 1883. So he married my great-great-grandfather's daughter, Elizabeth. My great-great-grandfather, his parents had come from Haiti. Under what circumstances, I don't know. He, too, went to a free African school and had 2 very good marriages. He himself never seemed to have amounted to much, but he had 2 good marriages. And the second one was into the Ray family, where Peter Williams Ray was a doctor and had a pharmacy. So he became a pharmacist as well, not through training, but through marriage. The other thing that I found was papers at the Williamson papers at the Schomburg. And in it was a memoir by a woman named Maricha Lyons, Memories of Yesterdays. And at the time, I didn't know it, but she turned out to be my great-grand-aunt. So her parents were Albro and Mary Lyons, and Mary, never mind, Mary and her sister Rebecca were sisters, and Mary marries Albro Lyons, and Rebecca marries Peter Guignon. So, okay. Maricha, in trying to write this Memories of Yesterday, felt that she was daunted. Her father had asked her to put together a story of his generation. And she had all this material from him, and she was daunted by the task. And she talked about trying to put together a memoir, and it was never published. It's about 85 pages, but was never published, using the vast output of fugitive scraps that had been left to her. So I start out by focusing on this idea of scraps and really invite the reader to think of my book as a scrapbook. The scrapbook pages on which the obituaries were pasted, the fugitive scraps that Maritza put together. But the book, of course, is chronologically, so I go from about, if you want to go from the end of the destruction of the Negroes' burial ground in 1795 to the death of my great-grandfather, Philip White, in 1891. But it is a cyclical history because I trace the ups and downs of the fortunes of Black New Yorkers. They were not just ups and ups and ups, but ups and downs and so forth. But I also think of my book as presenting a spatial history, and of Black New Yorkers as living in a series of concentric circles. So that is the way I'm going to organize my talk today. And if I did all the circles, we'd be here forever. So I'm just going to focus on a couple of them. So the first circle is what Alexander Crummell, in writing my great-grandfather's, Peter Guignon's obituary, referred to as the wide circle of leading citizens of New York and vicinity, and that is the Black elite. The second, then, is the Black community, and that's what we think of mostly when we say Blacks. We think, oh, yes, the Black community. Just to throw out some numbers, in 1840, there are approximately 16,300 Blacks out of a total population of 312,700. And then in 1860, about 12,500 Blacks out of 814,000 whites. In 1860 in Brooklyn, there are about 5,000 Blacks and 300,000 whites. So you can see how small the population is. What I'm going to focus on when I come back to the meat of my talk is then the next circle, which is Gotham itself, and the fact that Black New Yorkers didn't live in a segregated neighborhood or in the Black community, but they lived in Gotham with all that that implied. The next circle is beyond Gotham. There are contacts with people in Boston, Philadelphia, and so forth, and I will not be talking about that. And the last is this idea of cosmopolitanism, of their fashioning themselves as citizens of the world and really claiming that they lived in the world. So to start with, I'm going to be really focusing on circle number 1 and 3 and a little bit of 5. So one is this idea of the wide circle of the leading citizens of New York and vicinity. And this is the Black elite. And the first thing I want to do is have us think about Black or African, as they were called at that time. Because I took one street where early Black freeholders lived, Collect Street, and looked at 3 families and their origins. So there were the Crummells, famous for Alexander Crummell, the son, the DeGrasse family, and my great-great-great-grandparents, the Marshalls. Well, Alexander Crummell was kidnapped from Africa, came from Africa. He was fully African. He married a woman named Charity Hicks, who was part of the Quaker Hicks family. So she had this English background. George DeGrasse was born and came from Calcutta, Indian. He was Indian. He married Maria Van Serly, who was of mixed Moroccan and Dutch ancestry. Then you get to my great-great-great-grandparents. Elizabeth Marshall, her maiden name was Hewlett, so she's from, again, the British family in Hewlett, Long Island. If you know Long Island, you know the town. And her husband, Joseph Marshall, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, came from Venezuela. So the first thing to do is to recognize the incredibly mixed background and ancestry of these so-called Africans, right, or Blacks, and to see the way in which when you are declared non-white, what are you going to do? And using Africa, the label Africa, as kind of a strategy of empowerment. It's what allowed them to come together as a community of non-whites to do what they needed to do. The other thing I want to point out is, of course, they were cosmopolitan. Of course, they were aware of the world. If you came from Venezuela, if you came from Morocco, from the Netherlands, you are aware of the whole world out there. What is really important in founding in this the foundation of the Black elite is education, and I could spend all my minutes talking about the importance of education, which is foundational and kind of runs through the entire book. Education, according to the Black elite, would give the values that could make Black Americans, Africans, into Americans. So it's a way of helping to make identity. It creates character, your inward moral values, who you are inside. It leads to respectability, how you show on the outside, proper behavior, deportment, so forth. It leads to wealth. And these people were New Yorkers, so making money was really, really important to them. I mean, if you wanted to be assimilated into New York, you had to try and make money, and a lot of it. Even then, absolutely. And a lot of it was real estate. And then finally, this whole idea of cosmopolitanism. So beyond the elite, what the elite became leaders of institutions, and this is the Black community. And in my book, I think of the Black community as a series of institutions, churches, mutual aid societies, benevolent societies, the kind of thing that I suspect that you know about and that I'm not going to talk about, except to say that here was where I came up against a huge research problem, which where are the women? And the women were so hard to find, and I needed to distinguish between, were they not actors, what Michel Trujillo calls silence of the sources? Were they not actors? Did they stay at home or not do anything? Or were they actors, but their activities, their activism didn't make its way into the archives? And that's what Trujillo calls silence of the archives. And it is very, very difficult to figure that out. And here they contrast with Philadelphia and Boston. I can talk about that more later. All right, so now I'm getting to Gotham. So they live in Gotham, and the really important thing to realize is that they're in Lower Manhattan, where all groups start out, right? And they are there mainly in Ward 6, but also in Ward 8 and Ward 4. So around where City Hall is now, and 5 Points is actually the center of their life. And I think what's really important to recognize is that they lived in mixed neighborhoods. And we can't think in terms of residential or living segregation. They might have been segregated in a neighborhood like 5 Points from block to block, or buildings within blocks. I'm not saying that they necessarily lived in the same house, but they were cheek by jowl, shoulder by elbow at all points. And this, I think, led to two consequences. One is high and low, white or black, immigrant or native born, Protestant or Catholic, you're experiencing this, you're having the same New York experience, which is a tremendous amount of filth, a tremendous amount of disease. If yellow fever is going to hit, it hits high and low, unless the high can escape to their country houses. Same with cholera. So that's one thing I want to emphasize. The other thing I want to talk about as a result of what I call distance and proximity is the fact that there was no set protocol for race relations in New York at that period. You would think that in this time of intense racial hostility that leads up to the draft riots, which I'm going to talk about in the beginning, that people would know, whites here, blacks there, and that there would be lines that could not be crossed. And yet what I found out is that what I call the rule of whimsy pertained. Basically, blacks never knew. You stepped out of your house, you never knew what was going to happen to you. And I get that from Maritza, my great-grand aunt, where she notes writing for colored folks depended on the whims of respective stage drivers. So one day you could try and get on a railroad car, you can get on. The next day, the conductor throws you off. One day, you can try and go to the Crystal Palace, which is the big exhibit modeled on London, the London exhibit, down in Lower Manhattan. One day you can get in, the other day you can't. There's a funny remark in the newspaper saying that people were casting the horoscope to find out whether they'd be able to get in. So this real acknowledgement on the part of Black New Yorkers of this rule of whimsy. Take high cultural events. Elizabeth Taylor Greenfield, a Black opera singer from Philadelphia, comes to sing in a hall in the city, and Blacks can't attend the performance of one of their own because there's no segregated pew. So they kick up a ruckus, and finally they're allowed to go. But on the other hand, a man named Philip Bell, writing in the newspaper, Frederick Douglass's paper, talks about being able to go to Goupil's Gallery, which was a very fashionable art gallery, Ballier's bookstore, which had, scientific books, Mercantile Library, opera, et cetera, et cetera. There are two other so one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I really couldn't do anything with it, but is to wonder, other than the nuisance factor, right? Can I or can't I? What is the psychological impact? What is it to live in a place where you just never know what's going to happen the minute you step out of your house? And I'm not going to go into this, but this might, in fact, be why St. Philip's, and I'm not talking about St. Philip's in the talk, although it takes up such a large part of my book. So St. Philip's Episcopal Church was not only a place of reverence, a place of devotion, but also maybe a sanctuary from this kind of psychological anxiety that Blacks might have felt in the city. What I want to do then is talk, in my last example, which is a very positive one, is that the other thing is that living in these cheek by jowl with whites, there was a lot of contact with white merchants, and the merchants ran New York. So I want to pause for a moment and tell the story of Peter Ray. Peter Ray was the father of Peter Guignon's, my great-great-grandfather's second wife. Her name was Cornelia Ray, and that's that family that had the pharmacy that he started working in. So Peter Ray was taken on by the Lorillard family, the tobacco family, a huge enterprise in Lower Manhattan. The term millionaire was first given to Peter Lorillard. And Peter Ray works for this man. He starts out at age 11 as an errand boy, and when he dies in the 1880s, he's the superintendent of the new factory in Jersey City. And in doing my research, one of these serendipitous moments that make it all worthwhile is being in the Arendt's collection at the New York Public Library, picking up a book on the Lorillards to do some research. All I find is the secret recipe for snuff, which is no longer secret, and I reproduce it in the book. And I decide I've had enough with snuff. I want to take it back, and I pick it up, and it falls on the floor. In my book, I don't say it falls on the floor, because who knows what they would do to me. And I pick it up on the other side, and this is what I read. Peter Ray is the name of the mulatto man who sorts out the tobacco for Lorillard, and who is so great a judge of leaf tobacco, and which will do best for snuff, and which for cutting for smoking and chewing tobacco. To find him, look in the New York Directory or ask one of Lorillard's men, etc., etc. So what I want to point out here is that Peter Ray was skilled at his job. He really knew tobacco. The Lorillards recognized it and rewarded him accordingly. And so I think these are some of the stories that we don't see, that we don't know about, but are there. Again, I would have loved to speculate about how Peter Ray felt about his job, that many in the Black community were abolitionists, so not only liquor, but tobacco would be, what is the word I want? it would go against a temperance belief. It would be a stimulant. It's a stimulant, and therefore a temperance belief. Did he have qualms about that? I don't know. The tobacco came from the South, from Virginia or Kentucky. Did he have qualms about working and making money off of a slave product? I don't know. So the last example I'm going to give on this idea of distance and proximity and living next to whites is that of my great-grandfather, Philip White, who really emerges as the hero of my book. So on one of the days in the draft riot in July 1863, a sergeant, a police officer, writes to Albro Lyons, that is Peter Guignon's brother-in-law, Maricha's father, and Maricha's my great-grandaunt. Mr. Lyons, sir, I have received yours from the bearer, and I cannot answer whether I can comply with it. I will see you this afternoon, as I mentioned in the other note, as I have been excused from my captain for that purpose. I cannot say today what will occur tomorrow. I will be at said drugstore at 3:00 p.m. this day with horse and wagon. And what I speculate, the only drugstore in the neighborhood would have been that of Philip Augustus White, of my great-grandfather. So why is it that in the middle of the draft riot, this sergeant who's trying to help the Lyons, whose house has been demolished, utterly demolished by the mob, feel that meeting at the said drugstore would be a safe place? So the story I'm about to tell about Philip Augustus White defies all the stories that we know about the draft riots, which is one of utter destruction of black property, of black goods, of black people. So the stories we hear about all the time are the colored orphan asylum, where, the mob assaults this asylum led by white women, 300 children in there who almost die, the assault on William Powell's home, the assault on Albro Lyons. But this is a different story. So here is what the New York Times writes in their obituary of my great-grandfather, Philip White, in 1891. When the riot was at its height, a crowd of men gathered at White's store to defend it from attack. Mr. White was warned by some of the businessmen that he would be wise if he hid himself. He said, "What have I to fear? Even if these men here could not protect me, there are as many men among the rioters who would fight for me as there are those who would injure me. Not the slightest attempt was made to harm him or his property." So I just found this such a fascinating account. It is recorded in Harry Albro Williamson's papers. So he is Albro Lyons's grandson, okay? It goes. The story obviously gets passed down until it gets to the New York Times. So what happened? And the New York Times kind of explains the story, which was that Philip Augustus White had been a very charitable man, and that he put down roots in the neighborhood and he wanted to stay there. He gave medicine, he compounded drugs for the people in his neighborhood, increasingly poor Irish. But when they could not afford to pay for the drugs, he gave them away for free. He gave them money. He gave them clothes. Obviously, there's a lot of altruism in what he did, but I think that also, as the very canny man, which he seems to have been, he realized that it was to his advantage. And I think that what he did was create a relationship of mutual interdependence between him and his Irish neighbors. He was really one of the community. So that when the Irish mob was descending upon him, he knew from the bottom of his heart that his Irish neighbors, and indeed some of the rioters, right, some in the mob, would protect him, and he was right. Okay, so I am going to skip number 4, the fourth circle, which is about contacts with people in other cities. although I can talk a lot about that if you want to later. And come to the last, which is the last circle, which is the cosmos or cosmopolitanism. And here we're going to move over to Brooklyn. So my story picks up in 1865, 1870, when they move over, the Black New Yorkers move over to Brooklyn, in part because of the draft riots, but also for a bunch of personal reasons. So here I was luckier because there are newspapers. Yes, many issues are missing. They don't last for a lot of years, but they're more substantial than the earlier newspapers. So this is T. Thomas Fortune, if any of you have heard of him, our great newspaper man. The New York Globe was the first name of his paper, followed by the New York Freeman, and then the New York Age. So he was part of the Black elite, and he will also have these newspapers, and he loved to talk about Black society and the Black elite. So he recorded their goings-on in exquisite detail. So my grandmother and her two sisters had these elaborate debutante balls, and the description of silk and organza and cashmere shawls and pearls and diamonds, and then the food just goes on and on and on. So these people were giving themselves lavish parties. There were also a lot of private clubs, and again, the goings-on and the menus of the dinners would be printed in full in the newspaper. So that many of the Black Black Americans of the time, when they heard about these goings-on, not only in Brooklyn but in other places, took to referring to this elite as whitewashed blacks and seeing them as doing nothing but aping white society. And here the response that many Black Americans gave was, you need to distinguish between imitation, which is imitating and copying the good parts of a society. It's emulation with the possibility of outdoing them. So that if you read Milton and really love Milton, that if you imitate, there is always that possibility of surpassing Milton, okay? Versus aping, which is servile and coming up with a lesser product. So Black New Yorkers would say, or Black Brooklynites would say that in all their activities, social event, but their writing and everything, that they were imitating rather than aping. And they were certainly what we call race men and women. So they formed two societies at the time. New York's Bethel Literary Association is one, and that was followed by the Brooklyn Literary Union. And in that, so despite all their, partying, in these two associations, they were really dedicated to race work. So they had both lectures and debates, and I'll just name some of the debates. Included, shall we support separate schools, i.e. separate schools for Black children? Resolve that we need wealth more than we do education. Resolve that we should encourage Western emigration. Labor is a greater power than capital, that we owe no party a debt of gratitude, and that we need industrial more than academical education. So you can hear here some of the Booker T. Washington Du Bois debates over education, that we owe no party a debt of gratitude. We've been blindly following the Republican Party. And what have we gotten? Not very much. So maybe we should think of becoming Democrats. Shall we support separate schools? We want integrated schools, but is there not a value to having Black teachers teach Black children? And these were really, really important topics. And this is where then women finally, in the 1880s, enter into the public sphere. So we have Maricha, my great-grand-aunt, who up until this point, at least in my book, has been the reporter of what Black men were doing. And now she becomes a person in her own right, very much involved in the issue of education, teaching primary school. And what she says is she's invested in the education of the masses rather than of the classes, which I think is a great phrase. And just really quickly, she gives, I'm not going to go over it in depth, but she really has an educational philosophy. So she says there are three essential components to education. One is information, which includes not only book knowledge, but critical thinking. The second is elevation or moral development and the formation of personality. And the third is the cultivation of the mind-body connection. Because she said she maintained that greater control over muscles led to greater mental readiness and concentration. So that's pretty modern, right? I mean, she's really very forward-thinking. So there are two associations that I want to briefly talk about that she and other Black New York women or Black Brooklynites are involved in, and then I'm going to just close with reading a brief paragraph. So in 1892, Ida B. Wells, the famous anti-lynching crusader, comes to town. She's run out of Memphis. She comes to New York, and she and Maritza become great friends. And in a way, I think it's Ida who gives Black Brooklynites the real impetus to get out there and do things. So they form an organization called the Women's Loyal Union, which later becomes part of the National Women's the Club Association. And the object of the Women's Loyal Union, and I'm reading here, shall be the diffusion of accurate and extensive information relative to the civil and social status of the Afro-American, that they may be directed to an intelligent assertion of their rights and a determination to unite in the employment of every lawful means to secure and to retain the unmolested exercise of the same. So one of the things they did was set up a questionnaire about the condition of blacks in the South that they sent all over the place to have filled out. They also lobbied on behalf of the Blair Bill. They were just really, really active. Another thing, that is a known history, but I found another, to me, totally unknown history, which once again breaks down our notion of black-white separation at the end of the century. So it seems to me, and I can be corrected by women historians, that we think very much of black women founding clubs, white women founding clubs, and the two as being very distinct. We remember Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin being ejected from a club, Fanny Barrier Williams not being allowed to join a club, white clubs in Boston, and so forth. But here I found some cooperation between white and black women. And it came through something which I'd never heard of, which was the King's Daughters. And I immediately assumed that King's was Kings County, Brooklyn, and it wasn't. It's King is God. And this is a group, an order that was founded by white women. And what they said is white women, any place in the country, can set up a circle of 10 women and go about doing good works, doing charity. So there are things like the Lower Light Circle, the Willing Workers, the Busy Bees, et cetera, et cetera. So black women in Brooklyn and Philip White's wife, Elizabeth, who was by now widowed, form a club called the Willing Workers Circle. And before long, they had joined forces with a white women's club, and that white women's club had already taken over as its project the Zion Home for the Aged, which was then a home for elderly black people in Brooklyn. And they joined forces, and they actually, the white women who had started this actually took African American women on their board of managers, unheard of at the time of the Colored Orphan Asylum in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. So Elizabeth became a member. She joined the board of managers and was eventually the second vice president. So just to conclude, to me, black New Yorkers, black Brooklynites achieved so much, and they wanted to be remembered. And so the question is, why were they forgotten? And all I'm going to do is read the last paragraph of my book. As the decades passed, time buried the lives of 19th century black New Yorkers. Peters and Phillips' contemporaries, and even members of the black elite born 1 or 2 generations later, had desperately tried to preserve their 19th century history. Among them were members of my family, Albro Lyons, his daughter Maricha, and her nephew, Harry Albro Williamson. Yet this history was all but forgotten by those who came of age in the 20th century. Perhaps this generation could not understand the past in the same ways as those who had lived it. Perhaps they saw only degradation, humiliation, and shame, rather than the dignity of struggle and resistance, and so the trauma of remembering became too much to bear. Or maybe with the entry into a new century and the proclamation of a new modernity, they were determined to leave behind what they deemed old-fashioned. Or maybe it was the geographical dispersal from lower Manhattan to Brooklyn and to Harlem and beyond that contributed to the weakening of their will to remember. Within my own family, it might have been generational conflicts too great to bind the younger generation to the older. But forgetting is not the same as erasing, destroying, obliterating. The past is survived, if only in the form of scraps. The archives have become a place for safekeeping, for storing memories of the past that were simply waiting to be brought back to life and light and life in the ripeness of time. Thank you.
I think I'm going to feel more comfortable up there, too.
Okay.
That is a little bit the lightest.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Great.
Perhaps the greatest compliment that I can pay Carla is, as I start my comments today, is to say, gee, I wish I could have done that. Since you've taken the time to come here today, I hope you've either at least read a little bit of Black Gotham, or I hope you plan to do so. So maybe I'm preaching to the choir here. But this is very sincere praise. What she's done here to send me off into these paeans of praise is create a book that hovers gracefully just on the true history side of fiction. She engages her readers from the get-go, pulling us into her own family detective story, weaving together the search itself, and that's what's so clever, with the stories of at least 4 generations of her family, including the Marshalls, the Rays, the Guignons, Whites, Lyons, Petersons, and others. What a skillful writer she is. But I've been struggling to decide where I'm going to go with my comments. Should I focus on what has defined the African American upper class? How do those class markers resemble or differ from class indicators in the white community? That question intrigues me endlessly and is something I've been trying to figure out for myself since my husband asked me years ago, how come your family has so much education and so little money? So I'll just give you a little bit of several of these things. Another thing that I admire about Black Gotham is Carla's relative lack of concern about the significance of skin color as a determinant of class in the African American community. I'm going to go there, Carla. Many people disagree with me on this one, but I think that a lot of scholars and non-scholars overstress the importance of color, at least as long as the drop of African blood definition was in play. Everyone in what at that time was the Negro community knew exactly how law and society categorized them. And that definition, I believe, brought us together much more than it tore us apart. That's not to say this question was and is irrelevant. It's not. But I just think that it's not as critical as some people have portrayed it. For instance, I think of the adamant insistence in some quarters that D.C.'s Dunbar High School admitted only light-skinned students, but I only need to look at photos of my mother's 1926 yearbook to see that classmates and teachers came in a wide variety of hues. The idea of color within the African American community is a critical determinant of class. an advantage that the lighter skin often lorded over the darker sisters and brothers. Is this entirely a fiction? No, I don't think it is, but I would only suggest that it's not perhaps as critical as we're sometimes told. That doesn't infer, however, that there was and is no correlation between skin color and class, but what I think it suggests is that many Negroes, I use Negroes a lot, as Carla often does, because when my own language was being shaped by my family in the mid-20th century, that was the acceptable nomenclature. So many particularly ambitious Negroes who were lighter skinned used family contacts with white people to their own advantage in terms of money, in terms of education, in terms of occupation, achievement, and the like. Those advantages, which appeared and took shape especially in the years shortly after general emancipation, often have been passed down through the generations. In this respect, class and privilege among black Americans are not that different from what they are among whites. Ours, in the larger sense, is by no means a classless society. And though hardly inevitable, class status does often filter down through many generations. And among many other things, skin color often correlated with class. So then, how does Carla define class within the African American community in Black Gotham? How is it defined? How was it defined? By person, by place? How did concepts of an upper class or an elite class of Negroes gradually morph over the years? We might also ask who both created and then accepted the validity and the worth of these class concepts. In my own recent book, Parallel Worlds, I assert the following about the majority community's perceptions of the minority. And this is what I say: many white Americans perceived and treated all Negroes as little more than cogs in an undifferentiated, perpetually inferior caste, despite obvious variance in their circumstances and abilities. Carla, however, lays out many categories that contributed to the definition of class. The most significant are education, deportment, culture, wealth, civic involvement and commitment, and ties of family and friendship. So in my mind, it's worthy noting that while she doesn't ignore skin color entirely, she gives it little heft compared to other things, and nor would I. All of the above factors, she argues, are significant. She explores them all and the ways in which they involved. I'd like to address another provocative aspect of Black Gotham that intrigued me. That is Peterson's analysis of the pros and cons of desegregation. In the 19th century, folks whom she chronicles here were well aware of the complexities of this question, and it has been a contentious and sensitive topic within the African American community over the years. She discusses it within the context particularly of New York in the 19th century, but it flared up powerfully again around the country in the decades following Brown v. Board of Education. Pretty much wherever they lived, African Americans from the 19th century through the 1960s were justifiably enraged by injustices and hardships heaped on them by legally imposed segregation. Many of them repeatedly, sometimes patiently, sometimes angrily, pounded on the doors that barred their admission to mainstream institutions and facilities. They hated the humiliation, discomforts, dangers, and indignities of segregated public transportation and other public facilities, just as they hated limited access to housing, jobs, and the like. On the other hand, they well understood the importance of community, their own black community. What advantage was gained if one moved out of a supportive enclave of family and friends only to find oneself in a so-called better neighborhood, but sometimes amid hostile whites? What advantage was gained if schools were desegregated, but dedicated black teachers lost their jobs and black students were made to feel unwelcome and inferior? What advantages were gained when blacks gave their business to white merchants and black businesses floundered? I think of how desegregating Major League Baseball brought about the decline of the Negro Leagues, how black undertakers became a dying breed, I didn't realize I'd made a pun until after I wrote that. When white establishments finally decided that they could and would bury Negroes. How corporations such as Revlon and Elizabeth Arden seized on potential new markets and swallowed up black-owned and operated companies that made hair and skin products catering to the needs of black women. I think of how many black insurance companies went under when mainstream conglomerates finally agreed to insure Negroes, how black newspapers declined when the New York Times and Washington Post and others reluctantly began hiring a few people of color and covering a few issues of interest to the black community. Carla's meticulous research for Black Gotham in the now almost defunct Black Press underlines the significance of this question. In many ways, though few of us would celebrate our country's Jim Crow history, these are sad stories. Peterson tells us that her black ancestors, like mine, believed adamantly that nothing should be denied them, either by law or practice, because of their race. On the other hand, that did not mean by a long shot that they didn't understand the potential emotional and economic downsides of desegregation. Carla and I have been talking about our similar research into our families' histories for a number of years. She also addresses the evolution and significance of the supposedly elite Episcopal Church for people in her family, much as I discuss it to mine in my earlier book, Homelands and Waterways. She further details the import of institutions such as Oberlin College, Howard University, the Freemasons' literary societies. In a more frivolous vein, I was especially amused that she tumbled across the Newport Ugly Fishing Club, a name I adore, as I had in my own research a few years ago. People who were critical for the 19th century larger black community, such as Alexander Crummell, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, James Weldon Johnson, Booker T. Washington, Ida B. Wells. All of these appear in her book just as they appear in mine. She also, however, details the intersections between members of her family and the mainstream white Americans and institutions that we often think of as white institutions. The major New York politicians, the industrialists, the philanthropists, Metropolitan Museum of Art, for example. These presumably were beyond the reach and ken and far outside the realms of interest for Negro Americans, except, of course, that they were not. The underlying enigmas of Du Bois often discuss dual identity, a Negro and an American, and, as Peterson infers, as citizens of the world as well. All of these things, all of these contradictions permeate her book. So these are some of the things that make it so challenging, so surprising, and ultimately so satisfying.
It's an honor to be here and to be, participating in something of one of the first public unveilings of this book. And it's particularly been a joy for me to hear your own voice speaking and telling some of the same stories that I most love to read. And as you listen to this, whether you've read the book or not, you may feel, as I do, that if you look at that title, Black Gotham, A Family History of African Americans in 19th Century New York City, it really isn't quite big enough, and it's a little too straightforward to really comprehend all the stories and things that unravel and spill out from this book.
You know that finding a title is the hardest thing to do, so, we did our best.
So a title is, it's a title that will sell. It's a good title. But as a historian of 19th century America, and having read through this book with great pleasure, my sense was that I think one of the concepts that a historian would take from this is to call it maybe the making of an African-American elite in urban space. Now, it was really interesting that you described this as a spatial history, which is a very hot way of doing history among professional historians right now, and you did it without knowing. So perhaps without knowing, but it is, it tells. And so, as a sort of spatial history, what the book is to me, to some extent, is. First of all, I'm making, to use an old-fashioned concept among historians, that really not only did you make the history as an author, but your characters made a place in New York City and Brooklyn. So this is really more than a family history, and it's more than just an African American history. So with that in mind, I'm going to review some of the things that you said and that are found in the book. Starting as you did with the genealogy, which I find utterly daunting. I could not do that kind of work, and I can't even rattle off family trees.
If you buy the book, there's a family tree.
But it does start there with a sort of act of curiosity that's repeated every day in the archives and the libraries across the United States. And in fact, family history, and one of the reasons this book will sell, is the primary way ordinary Americans really engage with the past. So it's something terribly important for a large number of readers. So it starts with a half-fortuitous discovery of those two names, Philip White and Peter Guignon. But from that, she threads out a huge story. But she's more than a genealogist from the very beginning, because I was noted that she was compelled to extend her family past beyond the ties of blood or a single line of inheritance. At a critical juncture, on the one hand, you described how you told the story from a street in Manhattan. But also, I thought one of the critical beginnings is at the Mulberry Street School, that it's in fact a group of young men who are the beneficiaries of an exemplary education. And as you said, that's what I read as well. Very much this is a story of education, not just family. This strand of the story carries all the way through the volume, right up to 1884, when Philip White, your great-great-grandfather, if I got that right,
great-grandfather,
occupied a seat on the Board of Education in Brooklyn. Philip White's erudition was also left in the family home, in the books of Shakespeare and Dante that you found with his inscription. The educational story culminates with a flourish of high culture in the final chapter when Philip secures a membership in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The family history that began with such obscure roots as mixed-race immigrants, perhaps slaves, perhaps free men and women, ascends up the family tree till finally we reach nearly the top of what was called an aristocracy. On one level, then, this is a story of social mobility in the American way, up by the bootstraps of education. And of course, it differs from that standard overtold tale among European Americans in that it is accomplished against great odds and despite vicious opposition. The story of obstacles and opposition climaxes midway through the book in the terror of the draft riots of 1863, which drove her ancestors out of Manhattan to Brooklyn, along with hundreds of others outside of New York entirely. Philip White and his cohort, however, dug in their heels in Brooklyn and fought every step of the way up the economic and social ladder. The founders of Black Gotham had to batter down the doors to professional status. They had to fight their way into the New York Pharmacy School, into the Pharmaceutical Society. And of course, the Episcopal Church was not altogether welcoming. They set up barricades to building St. Philip's Church, being ordained, and rising to the pulpit in your own parish. And even then, upward mobility did not tear down social boundaries. Schools, churches, social clubs, if not neighborhoods, which is a critical point, which I'll return to, remained segregated. A beleaguered minority, Peterson's protagonists built a protective enclosure around themselves. This was the hard-wrought making of Black Gotham. The leaders of Black Gotham build their social world with stalwart determination and occasionally with defiance. The fiercest battles were fought early in the history. One had to cheer when a group of parents at the Mulberry School got a white teacher fired for beating a child. For example, when a group of aspirant seminarians go to theological training in New Hampshire, where they were met with violent opposition, and they managed to retort with gunfire. They armed themselves and dispersed an angry crowd. As Black Gothamites became more economically secure, their struggles took place in more genteel quarters like the Episcopal Church, where they were less violent but perhaps psychologically more tortured. Slowly, the founding generation had to accommodate with strategies of dealing with white racism. The parishioners of St. Philip's Church survived anti-abolitionist riots only to be assaulted by the softer racism of their white Episcopalian brethren. The ordination of the first pastor of St. Philip's Church was made conditional on his resignation from his office in the American Anti-Slavery Society. Judged harshly by some, who was accused as being intimidated and frightened, he, like others, was pressed to make some painful compromises. Perhaps the most painful example of these compromises was another member, I believe, of the Mulberry Street School, Alexander Crummell, who was rejected by the Episcopal bishop, in Crummell's words, with violence and grossness. And Crummell reacted angrily at first and forcefully. He exposed this action in the black press, but he too had ultimately to concede defeat. And this resulted in, among other things, a lament penned by W.B. Du Bois that read, "Like some grave shadow, he flitted by those halls, pleading, arguing, half angrily demanding admittance until there was the final no, until men hustled the disturber away, marked him as foolish, unreasonable, injudicious, a vain rebel against God's laws." As the nation careened toward the Civil War, that shadow seemed to cast a new caution over Black Gotham. Philip White made peace with the Fugitive Slave Act, for example, and withdrew into more traditional political channels in the Republican Party. Peterson describes how Black Gothamites settled into a segregated world that in some respects resembled the white middle class. They practiced hard work, piety, temperance, self-control, devotion to business. As she puts it, of her great-great-great-grandfather, Philip White, he operated on the principle that with hard work and discipline, he could achieve any goal he set for himself. And he did. But another fixture of the black middle class culture can be gleaned in the margins of Black Gotham, as Carla has repeated here, that there was a certain allegiance to the doctrine of separate spheres of women and men. Occasionally we see a glimpse of some exceptions to this convention, particularly in the early years. We learn that Cornelia Guignon was listed as the owner of the family dwelling, that her great-grandmother again, Elizabeth Marshall, great-great?
Elizabeth is my great.
I can't get all, but they're all great. All grandmothers are great. But Elizabeth Marshall opened a bakery in her cellar when she was widowed. Another widow supported her family by doing domestic labor in her church. With these exceptions, however, of these exceptions of women acting as breadwinners, most of the mothers, particularly the later generation, much to your frustration, seem to conform to the convention of domestic femininity. You say that you're haunted, but that you couldn't find much more about your other great-great-grandmother, and you were embarrassed to find that your female ancestors who show up in the historical record were not feminists or political leaders, but debutantes, and were called buds in the socialite parlance. Aside from this, appearance in the record, it's largely men who tell us family history. The failure to uncover feminist heroines contrasts with the history of women in other cities, the Fortin sisters in Philadelphia, Ida B. Wells in Chicago, in my town, Baltimore, Frances Watkins Harper, the very voices that spoke so eloquently for the liberation of women and African Americans in your previous book, Doers of the Word. Is this an anomaly a matter of location? Is Gotham particularly inhospitable to feminism? I sometimes wonder. Or is it a function of the religious affiliation of this elite? Suggestion is it, what about Episcopalians as opposed to the AME or the Baptist Church? Or is it a matter of time? Later generations of women seem to have become more active and prominent. We know the women's era was about to be born. Or is it a matter of class? Put bluntly, that elites, black or white, are more likely to harbor socialites than feminists. To my reckoning, the question of class is particularly pertinent, as I think we're all agreeing. Of necessity, Carla's drawn a rather tight boundary around the black aristocracy. When the divide between black elite and other classes of either race is breached, however, it's revealing. She describes that example of the relatively civil interracial relations when white neighbors act to protect the home of her ancestors from destruction by an angry white mob. Likewise, the elite Union League raised a black regiment during the Civil War. You specifically argue at one point among these rarefied elites that class trumps race, like the members of the Metropolitan Museum. Your great accomplishment has, in fact, been, as you set out as your intention, to restore to a history, a record of African American achievement and depose any assumption that the place of African Americans in our history is a sentence of only poverty, oppression, and obscurity. But still, I would like to ask of Gotham, what of the race relations at the bottom? They do appear here. And the cases of brutal racial violence strike outside of elite circles, unleashed in the streets of districts where poor of both races resided cheek by jowl. You're right, there's no residential or racial segregation in these neighborhoods, but there are very different neighborhoods. There's a big difference between 5 Points and other neighborhoods. So because Carla Peterson intends, as she says, to give a face to those left faceless, and because you write very movingly about those poor districts and the neighborhoods where white racism festered, I think that I might, if you'll permit me, make a few brief comments on lower class Gotham. Along with the wives and the daughters of rich men, the vast majority of New Yorkers leave but a pale trace in the archives. Their family history seems irretrievably lost. Childless women, for example, are left bereft of the great-great-granddaughters who will reclaim them from historical anonymity. If being married with children was the only road into the history books, we would be denied many heroines, black and white, Mary McLeod Bethune and Nanny Burroughs, as well as Jane Addams and Susan B. Anthony. In the 19th century, the prerequisite of conventional family status is especially prohibitive of historical access for African American women, be they slaves or free. In cities and on plantations, the sex ratio was such that African American women might have greater difficulty finding a mate and having children to bear their names and survive to childhood. It's just a problem of the archives in a way. The highly biased documentary record has left the vast majority of all Americans, by this standard, to be orphans of history, without progeny to tell their story. So it's worth taking note when those without a patrimony or a pedigree appear on the sidelines of Black Gotham. And I think, though it's been overtold, I think of the residents of the Colored Orphan Asylum, of them, not those who burned the asylum to the ground. Left homeless when their quarters were burnt and ruined in the riot of 1863. It will take yet more of the kind of assiduous work that Carla Peterson has done to bring these orphans into written history. But I'm happy to say that work is underway. A recent PhD at Johns Hopkins named Sarah Edelman has scoured the records of the New York Colored Orphan Asylum and in the process exposed some of the everyday unsung heroines of African American women's history. Widowed, unwed, or deserted mothers regularly surrendered their children, known as half-orphans, to the asylum. For the short term, they calculated that it was the best strategy to keep the rest of their families fed, sheltered, and cared for while they went to work. And in better times, they would fight to rescue their sons and daughters from the public institutions. And so that's another note that is very prominent in this book that I really believe needs to be underscored, that what is revealed is not just private families, but public institutions and how important they are. It was public institutions for the care of orphans and others in need of family support, moreover, that Peterson finds a byway of history, which she had also just spoke of, where, as she puts it, gender trumped race. It was in the Zion Home for the Aged in Brooklyn that for the first time we find white and black women coming together outside their families for a common cause. You're right, this is happening at that period all over. I think, for example, in Chicago, where Ida B. Wells and Jane Addams are sort of doing parallel things, but sometimes come together. And the most interesting anecdote I recently run across is that Ida B. Wells and Jane Addams sit together at a benefit that is held in the Peking Inn in Chicago, south side of Chicago, which is a gambling place and a place of it has this tawdry reputation, but they're willing to embrace together this kind of different space of the city, and an omen of a new, vibrant modern culture that's developing in the 20th century. Anyway, the backstory of the public institutions, orphan asylums, homes for the ages, and those public schools leads me to acknowledge gratefully what Carla Peterson has told us about not just one family, but the last term in her title, New York City. In searching for her ancestors, she recreates, and I hope you read it for this as well as the family story, the spaces of the city, from the schools, the workplaces, the churches, that drugstore, where, not only did your great-great-grandfather earn a living, but they used it as a polling place. Yes. And it's great stories there. And tobacco factories, the squalor of Five Points in Manhattan, and the genteel family residences in Brooklyn. In shared urban space, furthermore, this reader finds hope that in another time of hardship, we can work out our common welfare. She writes, and I think it's about this same event, but is it not possible that New York neighborhoods might have functioned like small villages where daily face-to-face contact with relatives and friends, but also with customers, tradesmen, co-workers, landlords, tenants, and the like, gave rise to acceptance, even social intimacy? If so, did blacks still live among strangers who hated them? Did they not have neighbors who loved them, or at least tolerated them and looked out for them when under siege? Many citizens of New York, Washington, and Baltimore are still under siege, and most Americans no longer live in villages. But thankfully, we still have other ways of getting to know one another, not just in city neighborhoods, which are still surviving, thank goodness, but also in reading books like Black Gotham.
Well, you've certainly whet our appetite for this book, all three of you. So I'm sure there are many questions and comments, and so the floor is now open. Please wait for the mic and identify yourself if you have a question or comment.
Do you want me to?
Yeah, right here. Yeah. You could just.
Excuse me. My name is Chester Hartman. I'm the research director for the Poverty and Race Research Action Council here in Washington. A linguistic question. The word and term Gotham, what does it mean? What is its etymology? Why do you choose to use it for your title? Is it specific to New York, or is it more general?
All right, I'll give you the genealogy of Gotham. So the first version of Gotham is an old English medieval story where King John, back in the 1100s and whatever, would go around the countryside and stop in whatever village, and the villagers would have to host him. And the citizens of Gotham, the small little village in England, who were considered to be very foolish and not smart, they decided to act foolish and stupid so that King John would not pass by, and they wouldn't have to put him up at great expenditure. So the idea is that the fools of Gotham were not really fools. So that's the original story. So in the early 19th century, I think it's in 1809, somewhere around there, Washington Irving, who is really the literary son of New York, and I have quite a bit, Black New Yorkers loved him, so I have quite a bit about, not quite a bit, but I have a little bit about him in the book. He wrote a collection of essays with a couple of other people called Salmagundi. And in it, he wrote about, he told tales. And one of them was imagining New York as Gotham. And he has this very funny little riff about how Gotham at one point is invaded by these outsiders. This is not my book, but in the book, but outsiders come in and they decide that they want to take over the town, and they decide that the best way to do it was to teach them dancing. And so, and there's a lot of French in there, so it's clearly a French invasion. So there are all these different stories about Gotham. But what happens is that after Washington Irving writes this piece about Gotham, everybody starts calling New York Gotham. So it is an insider's claim. And when you refer to Gotham and when you refer to yourself as Gothamites, it's a claim to belonging, to citizenship, to being a native son or daughter of New York. Now, about almost 10 years ago, Mike Wallace in New York, he's at the CUNY grad school, wrote a book called Gotham. And many people think, and it's a comprehensive history from the beginning to consolidation, 1898. And many people think that I riffed the title off of him, and I didn't, because in the 1850s, when these Black New Yorkers are writing essays, articles in Frederick Douglass's paper, they refer to their city as Gotham, and they refer to themselves as Gothamites. So this is an insider claim. And yeah, if you were in New York, you'd know it.
And there still is a extant town in England called Gotham?
I don't know. You would have to Google and find that out. But that is the legend.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I thought it came from Batman, but
Is it Goat Town, did you say?
Goatstown.
Goatstown.
And then came Gotham. You can Google it and find out.
Yes, please. Wait for the mic. Yeah.
Hi, I can't help but wonder.
Could you give your name, please?
Thomas Burton. I got a sense from your talk and then the comments from the others, it made me wonder whether or not New York is actually a different kind of city than, say, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, and Boston in how people live and where they live in terms of segregation and that sort of thing. And so it made me wonder, is New York unique from those other places? And I also couldn't help but continue to be curious about people's ambivalence, African Americans or Negroes, Black people's ambivalence about how they live and where they live, or elite blacks' ambivalence about how they live and where they live, and had the opportunity to exercise this freedom of movement in a way that maybe people in these other cities did not, and sort of how, just a little bit about that, people's ambivalence, psychological issues, as well as whether or not New York is actually a different kind of city than, say, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, and even Boston.
Well, I'll start it, and you can kind of pick it up. The key thing is that we know most of these northern cities at this particular moment have relatively small African American populations. So I find it interesting to put it alongside a place like Baltimore that had both slaves, that declining numbers of slaves, and a huge population of free African Americans. And in those contexts, I don't know if we have any other example of a city of that period that has a draft riot, and that, there are small riots, tiny skirmishes, but nothing as sort of traumatic as that, which might start it all off very differently. But there are small, other cities all have small groups of free African Americans who have the same sort of economic stature, I think, as we find here, and they all do create the elite, the aristocracy that you've described. And I don't know if it is that different. I was thinking about it, frankly, as a women's historian, and sometimes as people have experienced the history in which some social movements are hard to germinate in a city as cosmopolitan and diverse and firmly established as New York City. I mean, I always thought that, the comparison with Chicago is very inviting, and whether that's a question of a time or a place, I don't know. But when you think of Chicago in the late 19th and early 20th century, and the power there's a recent, the last thing I will say, which is an interesting contrast with this, is that I just read a recent book on Chicago. The point being about African American Chicago, it's by DeVarian Baldwin. I don't know if any of you have read the book, but its point is to displace Harlem, in the history of African American culture, because Harlem is associated with an intellectual elite. Chicago creates baseball players and prize fighters and a different kind of broader culture, which may be effective of location or time. Does that start? I'm sorry, I didn't conclude.
I was just part of a seminar a couple of days ago about Washington, D.C., and Washington, D.C. as having a Harlem Renaissance before there was a Harlem Renaissance. And this is a city that in some ways was more like Baltimore. I mean, of course, it's the capital, but other than that, in that it had a large free black population as well as a large slave population, and those things were different. But I think as you move into when you move into the 20th century, when you talk about the Great Migration north, I mean, not that was something that happened between any kind of specific points, but it's when you move into the 20th century that you begin to have these huge populations of black people in New York City, not only in Harlem, but in Brooklyn and in the Bronx and in Queens. And every place. So I think that New York's, she's talking about the old black New York families, but when you have this huge influx is really in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and then the huge influx only goes west during World War II. So it's very hard to say that in any kind of definitive way that X happened at X particular time. I mean, you have to make those parameters and understand that history moves people in different directions at different times, and therefore that the cities evolve in different ways in different times.
Okay, so to go back to the 19th century, which is the only century I know, the comparison with Boston and Philly, my sense, and I know this for sure about Boston, and I'll speculate the same with Philadelphia, is that the African American community in New York was a lot more dispersed than in those two cities. And I know that for sure with Boston. So that there was segregation. Blacks in New York tend to be lumped in certain areas. 5 Points, Lawrence and Thompson Street on the west side in Ward 8, 4th Ward, 15th Ward. But so they were clumped together, but a little bit all over Lower Manhattan. And my understanding is that in Boston, and I would venture to say in Philadelphia, they're all much more concentrated in one place or perhaps two places. So one of the explanations that the great historian of the draft riots has given is of the New York draft riots, Ivor Bernstein, was because of their dispersal of black New Yorkers in 8, 10, 15 different pockets. It made them much more vulnerable to the riot, that, they couldn't band together as easily. The police couldn't get to 15 different places at once, whereas in Boston or Philadelphia, it might have been 2 or 3 places. So I think that is very peculiarly New York. If you want to talk about New York being its own place within the black community, it is quite distinct from Boston and Philadelphia. For one, this chase for wealth really sets them apart from the other cities. But there's a reason. One is we need to get money like every other New Yorker, right? That's what we do when you're in New York. But another is a poll tax, so that in New York, the right to vote is taken away in the Constitution of 1821, and there's a poll tax of $250 that's instituted. So one of the things is to have black New Yorkers make that much money so that men could vote, right? In Massachusetts, blacks had the right to vote the entire time. That was not an issue. And in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, I did a little research with Julie Winch, and she says the situation was so murky, it was so unclear, that black men just tended to shy away and not go there. They weren't going to take on the vote. So for black New Yorkers, taking on the vote was really important. That was the act of citizenship. That was manhood. That was really important to them. What Philadelphia blacks and Boston blacks did was throw themselves into the anti-slavery movement. That was their cause. And of course, Boston is William Lloyd Garrison, but he also has incredible ties with Philadelphia. And I'm actually writing a little piece for the New York Times Disunion Project now. I did one a few weeks ago on black men, and now I'm doing one on black women. But actually in this one, I don't know why it's here, I found a quote in The Liberator from the 1840s where this Boston writer complains and says, "What's wrong with you men in New York? When you're so retarded. You're not on the bandwagon. You've lost the anti-slavery spirit, et cetera, et cetera." So black men in New York really focused on that right to vote. That was their manhood issue, more than anti-slavery. I could also say something about the difference with black women, and if anybody's interested in the two places. Or
Yeah, I'm interested. Yeah, we want to hear about that.
Okay. So I think that and it actually just ties into what I just said. I think because black men in New York were so single-mindedly focused on entrepreneurship, wealth, and black suffrage, those are male issues. And it didn't leave black women. There wasn't a point at which they could really intervene and be productive in that arena. It's also true that the interracial anti-slavery movement was a lot stronger in Boston and Philadelphia. So we have interracial women's societies, the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery and the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society are integrated. That is not true in New York. And, I think because New York was such a pro-Southern place, the commercial ties meant that they were really tied to the South and to the West Indies. And their anti-slavery society was headed by the Tappan brothers, who were not nearly as pro-women's rights as was Garrison. So you don't have the coming together, and you described the kind of fruitful coming together of black and white women in New York that you do in the other cities. But there's also this absence in the archive. So I don't know. Maybe they did do stuff and it just didn't survive in the archive. I don't know. But in this piece that I'm writing for the New York Times, I talk about that and the lack of information and how little they did, and also some very snide comments by black men. I mean, Alexander Crummell makes this really dismissive comment about black women in the 1830s, about how they have no literary ambition and they didn't know how to think of higher things. I mean, that's really snide, right? But what happens, and I think, again, it's around the Colored Orphan Asylum, women start to emerge and they start doing the very female thing of organizing fairs, right, to benefit. And that was typical of anti-slavery women, to organize these fairs to benefit the anti-slavery movement. And so black women in New York do it around the Colored Orphan Asylum. And they're not allowed to go on the board of managers, but they can, run these fairs, and the proceeds goes to the Colored Orphan Asylum. And I think it's the minute that the Colored Orphan Asylum, and I really don't fully articulate this in the book, I think it's the minute that the Colored Orphan Asylum burns down in July 1863 that black women said, in New York, say, we're there. We're activists. Because it's after that they join all these relief efforts for black soldiers, and they're there.
I just wanted to pick up on one thing that Mary said. I think that that maybe the women that you look at, the families that you look at, were so elite that the women didn't get involved in organizations. I wonder if we could take, whenever I've thought about the what's it called, the Black Negro Women's
National Association of Women.
National Association of Women, Colored Women's, right. I mean, when you see their pictures of them, I mean, I haven't really worked on them that much, but I mean, when I've gone through their records, it seems to me that they look very upper class. I mean, they're extremely elegant, they're beautifully dressed, and it seems like they have all this leisure time they have the time to participate in these organizations. They travel, they go to the meetings all over the country. So these seem to me clearly upper class women. So, I mean, I wonder if you could work back from the roster of that organization. What cities did those women come from?
Well, you think of Josephine St. Pierre.
Josephine Ruffin, yeah, right.
In Boston is very elite. But I think, in all these questions, time is really critical, too. If you had gone a little further into New York, we might have found
further
more.
into the 20th century.
Most of it is later, but
still
not as prominent.
Right.
I mean, you can't really identify who are the feminist Gothamites in 1900. Don't even know.
Well, and my sense from my work in the archive, it was Ida B. Wells. It took an outsider to really galvanize them, and so she comes to New York. And she's met on the docks by T. Thomas Fortune and my grandfather, Jerome B. Peterson, who say, there's a price on your head, you can't go back to Memphis. So write in the pages of the New York Age. And then the black women hear about it and they decide to give her a dinner, and they honor her with a dinner. So, of course, social event, they have this huge dinner and everybody comes. And Ida must have said, okay, ladies, beyond the dinner, you can certainly do something. So that's when they start the Women's Loyal Union. Mm-hmm. So there is a little, there's some church organizations early in the century, in the 1830s, 40s. There's one society called the Ladies Literary Society that I talk about in my book, and it started by a woman named Henrietta Ray. And if you look into, her husband, Charles Ray, on the one hand, he's saying women ought to whatever, but he's also, when it suggested that women be able to go to one of these national conventions of colored men, accompanied, and just observers. He said, no, they should stay at home. Men can do much better with their wives at home than abroad with them. So there just really seems to be, so far, there seems to be something about black men in New York that...
But also, I think that, we have to understand that the whole society was very sexist too, and not put this just on black men.
Yes, absolutely.
But white women during this period are certainly organizing around their churches. I mean, they're organizing Dorcas societies or relief for orphans or widows or something like that. I mean, that's the kind of organization you find in the antebellum period.
But if we look, like there's a tendency in New York to look to the, to the top, whether it's Harlem Renaissance or this book, and in fact, historians are uncover more of the middle class experience. And I think if we look at that level, certainly there are, not only are there African American church groups everywhere and ministers and all sorts of powerful stuff, but there also are more mixed race. I mean, you think of Philadelphia, where it's not just the anti-slavery society, but segregated African American societies where black men are supporting suffrage. It really is, quite different. But in some of that may be that you look to a deeper into the class structure, and you'll find much more. And you also find a different sort of organization, I think, of gender among African Americans, like moral reform societies and mutual aid societies among African Americans are more likely to have men and women joining together, and among whites that almost never happens. So I think the point is we have so many more things to discover, and the last point about that is historians don't do much New York because it's just too big. I mean, you and Mike Wallace are the people that have taken on this huge city with this complicated history. So we don't know as much. We just don't have the secondary sources.
One suggestion, one tip for anybody who wants to follow up, and it's school teachers. Because, and this is again, one of you suggested it, where do you find the material? If you don't have a black archive, go to a white archive like the Colored Orphan Asylum, and it's what I call entering through the black door. So 90% of the Colored Orphan Asylum records are going to be about the white women, etc., and then the children, but every once in a while you'll find the name of black women. So I went to the Public School Society records, so that's the predecessor of the New York Board of Education, right? And they have lists of teachers, and there are a lot of women teachers, but there are no stories attached. But there's Sarah Ennals, Fanny Tompkins, Caroline Rowe, and then there's some names where that they are part of a family of a prominent man. So Rebecca Peterson, not related to me. Her father was John Peterson, a very eminent educator, okay? And then one of the Ray girls. So perhaps one way to go would be to look at this list of teachers and then start looking around in the archive, seeing whether, having had the names, you can then start to put stories to them. And then they come up as the ones in the 1850s and 60s. It's the same names of the women who are found, starting up, running these fairs for the Colored Orphan Asylum. And then when they start the relief organizations for black soldiers, it's many of the same women. So maybe the public schools is the where to go.
I wonder how. Oh, was there? Oh, sorry. Yeah, Sandra. But wait for the mic, please, and identify yourself.
I'm Reverend Sandra Butler Truesdale, and I'm a fourth-generation Washingtonian. And as I sat and listened, I thought about the fact that I'm the brown child in a family of really light-complected blacks who have been in Washington, D.C. for 125 years in the same neighborhood. I was just sort of kind of listening to his question about similarities and differences in Washington, D.C. As I listened to you talk about the vote and how it affected men and what they thought about that vote. And it was not so in Washington, D.C. because the vote was not here.
Right.
So that's the difference there.
Right.
Neighborhoods, communities, and villages. I have not read the book yet, but I'm certainly going out and get it and read it. But as I just listen to you all, it seems to me that the neighborhoods, villages, and communities were similar, if not the same, as New York. As a matter of fact, I listened to her statement about Washington, D.C. and New York, and how we talk about Washington, D.C. as having been the first Broadway. I wanted to say to you that in case you're looking for research, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs headquarters is right here in Washington, D.C. at 16th and R Streets Northwest. And so it's possible that you can go in there and you can see the photographs and the histories there. And you may be able to, I'm not sure, but you may be able to pull out some history from there.
Wow. Okay. Thank you.
I was wondering what difference north-south makes. You know, what difference does it make that you know that they're, you know, by the time a lot of your history that you're discussing takes place, that slavery is gone in New York City or in New York State and in the North generally, and then after the Civil War. You don't have Jim Crow, and so and I was thinking about Marjorie and I were talking earlier about Glenda Gilmore's work on North Carolina, and she talks about the fact that women became so prominent in club work and so forth and civic organizations because the men couldn't do it. So I'm wondering if that's another sort of and then going back to your point about the vote, I mean, the fact that men had the vote in New York City and they organized around it, whereas, of course, that wasn't a possibility for men in the South, and then later Jim Crow prevented men from from putting themselves out there. But again, in New York City, the restrictions wouldn't have been as great. I don't know how much you've thought about or looked at southern cities, and maybe Adele has some thoughts about this too.
So what kind of restrictions are you talking about?
Well, I mean, men really took a risk if they put themselves out in. I mean, they were really a physical risk.
I mean, like death.
Like death,
Okay.
like death,
Right.
yeah, or lynching or whatever. In the
But
South,
they also couldn't vote.
Yeah.
And so in the
Right.
absence of a male public figure to represent the family, women used sometimes channels to white women, and as I recall Gilman saying. So
Yeah.
it's really, because if the family can be represented by a male, it might lead to relative subordination for women politically. And I was wondering what's critical. I can't remember the history correctly, but African American men had a property restriction for their voting at a certain moment in antebellum New York.
Yeah.
So that would mean
1821.
Yeah, so that would
Yeah.
underscore the importance and the
Yes.
prominence of both class and race for
Right.
men in New York, and that might
Right.
have a really powerful effect.
Right, yeah. That's what I was trying to say before. And so, I mean, and the acquisition of wealth, it's like, yeah, I want to be wealthy so I can do all these fancy things, but it's also to get voting status. So that was, to be able to pay that tax.
But did they, I don't know how long the moment is, but were African American men who had enough property to vote petitioning to get the end of the property restriction?
Oh, yeah.
They were.
Yeah. And so the complaint from men in Boston and Philadelphia is you're not doing enough for the anti-slavery cause. And I don't think that Black New Yorkers bothered to answer those people in Philadelphia and New York, but they were like, their number one priority was to get back the right to vote. And I think it's because at one point they could vote, and then all of a sudden in 1821 it snatched away from them. So the indignity was all the greater. And so, yeah, so that was a huge, yeah. So in, what was I going to say? In the postbellum period, I'm not quite sure how to answer. I mean, what I could say is that Black men get really involved in party politics. Mm-hmm. And in the 1850s, they're just not sure. They look at the Free Soilers, they look at the Liberty Party, they look at the Radical Abolition Party, they look at the Republican Party, and some of them are in, some of them are not so in. But after the war, it's like, you know, we need to choose a party affiliation and really push for our rights. And they're, you know, largely 90% Republican. But there are some people like George Downing, T. Thomas Fortune, and who's the third one? T. McCann Stewart, who say, what has the Republican Party done for us? So let's go to the Democratic Party. So they vote for, who was it, Grover Cleveland, et cetera, et cetera. So they're very invested in party politics in a way that women aren't. There's intense segregation, and so at the end of my book, I have a tiny little thing on T. Thomas Fortune goes into a hotel in New York, and he sits at the bar and wants to have a drink, and he's told he can't. And later on, they apologize and give him money or whatever, but he gets, the lawyer, T. McCann Stewart, to take his case to court. So in New York, they feel in the 1880s and 90s that they are losing ground. How does Tammany Hall figure into that, and how do this is the period when more and more immigrants are coming from Europe, especially. Does that kind of displace them, or is that part of the story? Yeah, I don't talk about that much in the book. By then, they're over in short displace. Yeah, it does displace them. It does, and Maritza, for example, has some very bitter words about how life is made so much more difficult by the arrival of immigrant populations. Yeah, bitter words. Yeah. One other thing I wanted to ask you: there seems to be this paradox. I mean, you conclude the book by saying how important it was that 19th century Black New Yorkers preserved their history. And yet but then in the 20th century, they forgot it. So it's a real paradox there. I mean, do you want to say a little bit about that? Yeah, and it's really, really hard to explain. And so if you take Arturo Schomburg and James Weldon Johnson, who were really both very desirous of preserving the past, the 19th century past. They were born, and Harry Albro Williamson, my granduncle, whatever, who has this huge collection at the Schomburg. They really wanted to preserve the past, and they were born in the 1870s. And I think it's the generation after that just was not interested and turned their back on the past and looked forward towards the Harlem Renaissance. So if they were born at the beginning of the 20th century, right, then came of age at the Harlem Renaissance, and that was where it was at. And the 19th century was old-fashioned, and this is what it meant to be modern. So I think that and then there were there was a lot of geographical dispersal. I've not been able to find any descendants. I mean, my family was not particularly reproductive, but even then, and they moved around. So from Brooklyn, they went to Harlem, et cetera, et cetera. And when I talked to other people in Philadelphia and Boston, it seems to me that a lot of those families stayed in the same place. And I finally contacted a guy in Brooklyn, and I was pestering him, and he said, well, I'm still here, but nobody else is, and I can't remember who he was. We were related in some way, and he knew nothing. He says, there's nobody around. So there's a kind of geographic dispersal that happens in New York, which I'm not sure happens in Philly.
You didn't really grow up in New York. You were traveling. Your family was traveling.
Right.
Yeah.
So what about in Washington? You said you're in the same place? I mean, did people stay put? Is it kind of the same neighborhood?
Well, people stayed put until gentrification, or whatever we call, quote, gentrification. They sort of stayed in the same neighborhoods, particularly if they owned their own properties.
Yeah.
I lived in one house for 52 years.
Yeah.
So, the difference, I think, is that it's transient now. And there's a big difference in how the neighborhoods look and who's there.
Another thing about New York, too, I mean, and it's sort of a cliche, but New Yorkers are renters, not owners.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, that's obviously not completely true, but I think that it does give roots and give permanence to people, regardless of race, in many other places. I mean, I grew up in an apartment in New York, and somebody once asked me, well, what did you do without a backyard? I said I never knew anybody who had a backyard until I was an adult. So in that respect, at least, New York is somewhat demographically different.
Right.
Unless you live in a rent-controlled apartment, in which case you never leave it. If you.
But it's still rental.
Right.
Yeah.
Last question, right back there. Yeah.
I can project. That's fine. Okay. Steve Locke at Georgetown. No. With a nod to your previous remarks, no snide comments from this black man. I really truly appreciate your presentation, Professor Peterson. Professor Ryan and you both mentioned Harlem Renaissance. You mentioned Schoenberg, James Weldon Johnson. I know that the book is before that kin, but wanted to know from all of you, I guess, why there seems to be such a woeful lack of either scholarship or narrative, fictional turns on that kind of aspirational life, that lifestyle, that level of interest by a family, by a community. And I guess to dovetail, what do you make of the perceived lack of emphasis on that level of education, that level of professional interest that was pretty much the case in your book, and not so much the case in society for the most part? Well, FM culture, FM subculture these days. I suspect you probably... Did you want me to tweak that, or do you pretty much have the gist of...
Maybe you could put it in question form. So.
Well, that's the question.
And you've got two different questions.
Yes.
So let's start with the first one about the Harlem Renaissance.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be... The Harlem Renaissance doesn't seem to provide many examples. It doesn't seem to be much in Harlem Renaissance era literature. Folk as broad as Cullen or even Hughes, people who came before him, Dunbar, about that kind of aspirational life. People, black families that put a pretty good degree of emphasis on education, on racial uplift instead of entertainment, that form of topic.
I don't know. I guess I would perhaps say you need to do a little bit more looking. I think that there's a lot of it out there. I mean, you look for example, and Carla knows this stuff much better than I do. The literature of the Harlem Renaissance, particularly women's.
Yeah, there's a lot of work on Nell Larson. Yeah,
women's literature. But if you're thinking, are you looking at contemporaneous things like that, or are you looking at analytical things?
Well, that and analytical. Full disclosure, I had Deborah McDowell, an undergrad down at UVA, so
yep.
we mined a good bit of it, but they just didn't seem to. Yeah, well, I mean, McDowell, what we likely did, but there doesn't seem to be as much as there could be, and certainly I didn't know that there were as many examples of that kind of uplift, economic and academic uplift, before going through portions of your book, Professor Peterson.
You mean in the period before?
Yes.
Well, that's because the people were blocked from doing it. I mean,
well, yeah, and I think that one thing, if I can just go on for a second, Mary, is that.
No, I'm sorry. In the period that she covers.
Oh, you mean in this very early period, in the early 19th,
The 19th century.
Well, in the mid to late 19th century.
Mid to late 19th century. Well, among other things, I think there were tremendous barriers to black people getting things published. I mean, I don't mean that stuff isn't out there, but I think that has really, really been true.
I'm not sure I quite understand your question. I thought, first of all, you were going to, why is it that we so value the Harlem Renaissance and ignore everything else? But
That's
part of it?
Yes.
I have no idea. I have no idea. And it is really frustrating. So I've been trying to get on a radio program, to do an interview. And the person, I won't name names, but they decided against this book. And the two things that they took was something on Harlem and something on slave revolts. And, that's, in the 19th century, it's slavery. And if you can sex it up and make a slave revolt, that's even better. And in the 20th century, it's the Harlem Renaissance. And why? I don't know.
I think, from the standpoint of professional history, two sort of things are happening within the last couple of generations. One is from the 1970s and 80s on, social history became the centerpiece. So everybody was looking for life at the bottom and would exclude attention to elite families and what you can stay. And people were trying to get everyday life and ordinary people. And second, then 90s and forward, cultural history takes a turn, which turns away from elite culture to popular culture. And so there are lots of things now coming out about, African American style and music and entertainment. So where that tells us a little bit about the, academic side, which is not exactly selling a lot of books at the moment in the university presses that put out this literature. So I think there's an opening now for a broader way. And I think there is, I'm told there is a lot of this sort of literature coming out.
Yeah. So, but to go back to Adele's point, I mean, the ability to get published was just, it if you studied with Debbie, it's just so difficult. So we get our professional writers in the 1890s with somebody like Charles Chestnut and so forth and so on. So what were the venues for publishing before that? It's largely newspapers. So literary critics, at least, have to be willing to go and, mine the archives and go through these newspapers and come up against, 5 issues missing and then picking up. But you'll find a lot in newspapers, and people are now starting to do that. So Francis Foster did the 3 serialized novels of Francis Harper and, Julia Collins, et cetera, et cetera. Then you're up against the whole thing of literary merit, but is it any good? So what do we do with these documents? Can we approach them from a literary point of view, from a cultural point of view, from an historical intellectual? And I don't think we yet have the disciplinary tools or interdisciplinary tools to really know how to approach them and what to say about them. But a lot of people, the Julia Collins book, when it came out, it was published as a little book, and somebody reviewed it and said, but this is awful. This is melodramatic, crap, junk, whatever. But that was the 19th century voice, That's the way in which people wrote. So, but what to me is so amazing is that people think, the Harlem Renaissance was so great. I think Toomer's Cane is one of the worst books I've ever read. But if you get a reading, if you shape the paradigms of a reading public so that they can accept this in some way as literary, then they'll read Cane and say, oh my God, this is just wonderful. So, that's the job I guess we need to do. And I guess I've passed that on to somebody else since I wrote a book that's historical. Anyway.
Well, we're very glad that you decided to trace your family's roots. We're all the beneficiaries of it, and we appreciate very much your comments and the comments of the commentators, and thank you all for coming. Please join us we have coffee and cake in the back, and I think copies of the book are still for sale, so you can get one and get a signature from the author.